So I'm going to mute myself.
Sorry. Apparently my please hold while I stop the ad that is apparently going. I promise I know how to use technology sometimes.
Well, I'm completely a novice at it, Katelyn. Thank you for sharing that. It's just so beautiful. Now I'm going to cry.
I hope the ad paused that.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, welcome everyone who has signed in, and we are going to mute everyone and ask that you, if you have questions for Katelyn, put them in the chat, and we have someone who will monitor that and bring those questions to us for her. So the first thing I wanted to do was, before I introduce Katelyn, is to thank uh, Laura Belanger, and she is our dean this year and has done a wonderful job with all the imprévu that we've had this year. And George Bozeman, who's, I don't see him signed in yet, but he's head of the, he's subdean and head of the committee that supported this event. And then our former dean, Kevin Lindsay, who I think will be signing in. Kevin has done wonderful publicity sharing this, and people know we're doing it. And they also know it's being recorded, so they may think, oh, we'll listen later. So hi to all of you who are listening later. And then to Jim, who is now in Maine, thank you so much for making this possible for us. So, and Bruce Adamai, who very aptly told me that I didn't have good bandwidth. Bruce, you speak up if you hear it again. I'm in Dallas now. It shouldn't happen because I'm just a few feet away from the biggest signal there could be ever. So I should be able to be heard, although I don't want to be heard. Katelyn is, as you see, a marvelous, marvelous musician. I actually got to hear her when I was one of the 7 people on the NYACOP committee who, in the finals for NYACOP, got to hear her perform. I had heard her before as she was coming up, and she did a wonderful concert for us in northern New Hampshire. But I have to tell you, and it's a secret, we're not supposed to say this, but all 7 of us who heard the finals were in agreement that she was the winner of that competition. There was no discussion of, well, she's a woman, or she has a dress, or anything like that. The playing was just front and center, and everyone was in wonderful agreement. And as you know, probably because you've signed on and you've seen her bio, she has won other competitions in France, in Russia, and in Japan. So there's something she's doing right that results in a female winning international competitions. And it's unusual, Katelyn, it really is. Her loving approach and technical excellence, which one of the reviewers said give a great sense of lyricism and beauty, which I think you saw in the angels that she was depicting there with her hands and beautiful musicianship. So what I'd like to do, Katelyn, is have you talk about your beginning before you went to Oberlin and before you talked them into giving you a Fulbright and then going to France and Germany and all of that, which we can read in your bio. It's very, very impressive. And her schedule, as you probably know, is very, very busy now. But how did you get inspired when you were a young girl in Maine? I know there are great organs nearby, so there's that, but to you.
Great organs and wonderful organists as well. I was very lucky to grow up in a musical family, although neither of my parents nor my brother are professional musicians. My father is an electrical engineer who worked for the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, and my mother is still self employed. She is an occupational therapist with a specialty in hands. So that's where some of my background for this interest in healthy playing techniques and injury prevention comes in. So I actually was rather a glutton for musical punishment. I started piano when I was 8 because I was so enamored with watching my brother play the piano that I just wanted to sit down and sight read everything. And my parents very wisely to prevent the cacophony from coming from the keyboard, got me lessons. So, and all I wanted for my, I think it was 11th birthday, were flute lessons because my mother played the flute for church very frequently. And I loved how that instrument sounded. And I was singing in the Sandpipers Children's Chorus in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But it was Diane Dean, the director of that children's chorus, and also Bruce Adami, who is tuning in here, who kind of saw me as that glutton for musical punishment and said, "Hey, you should look into this wonderful scholarship program, the Young Organist Collaborative, which really is an incredible program. I think they've put some 300 students through at least 1 year of pipe organ lessons." So in 2001, the Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire gave $1,000 to St. John's Episcopal Church in Portsmouth when they installed their new Laterno organ. Just in case you don't know about this, although you're New Hampshireites, so I do know all about this. But he said, get young people learning to play this thing. So I was one of those young people. I won a scholarship in 2005, and I then was able to play the pipe organ all through high school and had to choose which instrument to pursue in college. And that was certainly going to be the organ, as it kind of encompassed all of the instruments that I so enjoyed. So I was fortunate to go to Oberlin, where I was able to major in both French and organ. And then I was awarded a Fulbright scholarship upon graduation. So I spent a year studying in Toulouse. Then I came back to the States for 2 years to work at the Church of the Advent in Boston, and then went back across the pond to Germany to study for 2 years at the Stuttgart Musikhochschule in Southwest Germany. And then my husband is an organ builder himself, so we're very fun at parties. And he works for John Paul Buzard Pipe Organ Builders in Champaign, Illinois. So that's where we're currently based. And Chicago is a wonderful airport through which to fly, even with COVID restrictions still continuing to some extent. So it's been a wonderful ride, and I've met some phenomenal people along the way.
I've seen your schedule, and I should tell people that they can follow you on your website and on your blog, which is really interesting. Your haircut in France and things like that. It was really wonderful stories, and a great travel through Europe, better than Steve, what's his name? Steve, yeah, right.
Up in Seattle. I don't think anybody's as good as he is.
Oh yeah. For an organist, this is the way to do Europe on your blog. And after the blog, you also have a YouTube channel, and you have SoundCloud and so forth, and all of that is connected through www.KatelynEmerson.com. So it's very easy to access, and you have your talks there too, the videos. So if people want to hear more about ergonomics and so forth, you have 3 videos on that, which are marvelous. So, yeah, you just stole some of my thunder. I was going to mention, what about the Kochmar organ? Did you hear that often, and were you aware of the Kochmar legacy in Portland?
So, growing up in Maine, in southern Maine, in York, the choices for big cities were either Portland or Boston. We were really equidistant. We're an hour from Portland, an hour and a quarter from Boston. So we would go to both cities for symphony concerts. I was very lucky to have parents who brought me to symphony and ballet. So I was aware of the Kochmar, but partially one thing that connected me very much with that was that my primary teacher during high school was Ray Cornels. And I was connected to him through the Young Organist Collaborative. And then I was able to spend 4 years studying with him. And of course, you can't quite see this, but I'm rather slight. I'm only 5'3", and he's probably about 6 foot tall. And I was a very precocious 14-year-old, and his quiet, his gentle giant qualities were exactly what I needed to get me to slow down and actually learn how to practice. And of course, he also got me involved with many of his outreach programs with the local schools because, as he always so beautifully said, we need to have somebody without gray hair playing at the console. So he'd have me on the Kochmar playing there. And I was also principal flute in the Portland Youth Symphony Orchestra. So we would play very frequently at Merrill Auditorium. And actually, I think it was my junior year, we did the saison with Ray at the keyboard and me in the middle of the orchestra, which was just great fun. So I've always felt very much at home there. They've been so, so welcoming. It's really extraordinary.
Um, your your heritage is, do you have musicians who go way back? Marie Claire Alain once told me that anybody who could play a Bach fugue could work in a few children, and that genes were really the gene pool she was very worried about, because all the organists in her day were, well, they weren't in my day. I mean, where in Texas, everybody around me, they were grand dames everywhere. They're wonderful women who were in charge of all the programs here early on. But that's changed, and Marie Claire was worried about about that. But does your genetic history go far back, or do you
The
know?
only thing, so on my mother's side, the only interesting tidbit that we know is that I'm somehow related to Anne of Cleves, but I don't think that would give me much musical background. My father's side, we don't know too much either. He's originally from Laconia. So he was, I think, the first of his generation to move out of there, first in like 4 or 5 generations to move from there. But what's really fascinating about what you're talking about, Susan, is so much of what allows children to grow up in music is exposure. There was that interesting study done where the only tidbit we took from it was it takes 10,000 hours in order to make a master of something. That number isn't really true. 10,000 was just the amount of hours that a bunch of violin students had practiced by the age of 21. So, what that study actually found, that it was the quality of the practice time and the exposure to the instrument that allowed students to become better. So what we really need to do is make sure kids are exposed to this sort of thing. There's a wonderful program in Baltimore with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra where they actually provide students with meals after school, and they provide them with instruments, so that the goal of the program is not so that those kids will become members of the Baltimore Symphony, but that their grandchildren will become members of the Baltimore Symphony. So yes, of course there is a genetic component, but I would say this is much more nurture than nature. It's our physicality. My hands aren't made to play the cello, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't be musical. So it's really interesting. It does take a combination, and we cannot discount the amount of influence that we have as people who can bring the instrument to anybody who might be interested to learn about it.
Have you seen the pipe orgle
Oracle
movement?
kits?
Yeah.
Yes, that's wonderful. This a little if anybody doesn't know about that, it's a little portative organ that they can take to bits, and they can show people how it works. Also, Kochmar Jr., you can actually see how the pipe organ works. That kind of program is absolutely spectacular. It's one of the best things that we can do.
Yeah. And I'm hearing too now that there are um, kids who are not churched. We have dying churches all over the especially over the Northeast, but where I am right now in Texas and Oklahoma, churches is big, but not interested in pipe organs, of course. But the TAO had an article, and you probably saw it, Leonardo Ciampa, about Dale Wesley. Was that his name? Let's see, what was his name? Wesley Hall. And he seems to be the king of TikTok, and has provided 140,000 followers with snippets of organ music. And he's had over several million people, kids mainly, follow him. So we have a different world. I can barely get online to talk to you with Zoom, and this already seems antiquated because the future is going to be really different. So you are doing your mission by playing so musically to everyone around the world that you're playing for. Do you envision teaching at some point too? I know you're doing workshops too.
So I have a studio of private students. And they kind of actually, I Zoom with quite a few of them. I have a couple in Germany that I work with, a few in Seattle, and a couple on the East Coast. I would say about a third is in person at the moment. And then as I travel, I get to see students in person. But I found that to be quite successful, particularly when people are working with me for some kind of ergonomic consideration or technique development, because I can help them to make videos so I can see what's potentially going on. I can send them videos and we can communicate that way so they can look back at kind of what we talked about to reference and also to make more observations. So I do teach. So much of what we do, whether it's in front of a choir or by ourselves, is teaching. So it's so important to work on that level of communication and also to take in the inspiration that comes from that relationship. It really is. It goes back and forth very much.
I wondered too if you had considered uh, after the Fulbright, after the time in France and then in Germany, and that was, would you say, equivalent to our master's degree or more, really? That if you were to teach at a university somewhere eventually, if that would be your interest after all the playing, it probably will never for you die down. It'll always be there. But there are universities too who are struggling for good teachers who know how to connect with students on a certain level of musicianship. It's often about technique and how fast can you play, and you have a lot to give in that. I I shouldn't be talking about this. This is probably something we should have
Well,
talked about
it's a really
personally.
interesting.
Sorry.
Oh, well, we could definitely do that, but it's a really interesting time in the university field because so many universities are in a hiring freeze. They were already having trouble before COVID, and then COVID hit, and they're just all just kind of waiting, particularly for organ programs. They're waiting to see what the field will look like afterwards. So we'll see. I don't have a DMA, which most universities really very much do want. What's funny is that a lot of people assume I have one, which I take as a very deep compliment because people work very hard for those. So we'll see what happens. I am very open to whatever comes along, and that's kind of been my path anyway. I auditioned for graduate schools as well as applied for the Fulbright, and then I had again auditioned for graduate schools when I was offered the job at the Advent. It's it may the way that sounded, it makes it sound like I just look for the next best thing, but actually I try and follow what makes the most sense with the information I have at the time, which I think in a way is hopefully all that any of us can do with our careers, and it's brought me to some really wonderful places, particularly New England, which is where my heart is.
Well, that actually makes me think of a story. Uh, One of my professors, who was very dear, known throughout the Southwest as the vocal teacher of our day here, and became elderly, and in his mid 70s decided to retire. And he had had a brilliant career. And if I said his name, you'd know it. But he decided to go to a place where he was not known at all. And he just went to a little place in Arkansas where they had progressive, as you age, you get to go to the grave eventually. And he wrote us back the first week he was there. He said, "Oh, they discovered that I could sing." And the second week it was, "Oh, they discovered that I actually could," long story short, he ended up directing the choir, and not only that, creating a regional choral thing. And it was a huge success until he died some 15 years later. But that brings us to the aging process, and I don't know if you have particular words of wisdom for those of us who are finding the process of losing our eyesight and our hearing because we're around organs so much, and our ligaments are failing, and the flexibility to play an octave is all of a sudden a challenge where we had an octave in the third before, and our brains are not as on top of things either. Our memory loss is become, well, I can't find the word. There it is. and our attitudes are challenged by that. So we have to deal with depression and moods. So there's a big cartload of things to ask you about if you have suggestions for those of us in that situation.
So I first want to acknowledge that I am not yet in that situation, and I am very aware that I will be. But you all have wonderful world experiences that I don't know yet. So if anything I say comes off as flippant or as not as nuanced as it should be, please call me on it, because I deserve to be called on it and I deserve to learn from that experience. And we want to hear from your experiences. So please do write into the chat if something doesn't make sense. It's really important that we learn from you, far more than from me. So I'm just going to touch on some things as regards the aging process. One of the things that I focus on very much is injury prevention, as well as injury recovery. And what's really interesting about musician injuries is that the majority of them are in what we call musician students, which are students who have just entered their studies. So they go from practicing at whatever they had to in order to get into college, and they enter conservatory, and all of a sudden they're practicing 4 to 6 hours a day, but not necessarily healthfully. So that's where we see the majority of injuries that are more acute. They're caused by overuse and misuse, were the two greatest causes of things that we can't control. Although we could control misuse to some extent. That does not discount that as we get older, things become a little bit more difficult. But what we do have as we age is we have that experience, and we do have the knowledge of ourselves and our bodies, which young people don't know. They have Superman mindsets, so they can do anything they want. As we get older, we know we can't, so we can work much smarter and more efficiently. One thing I do want to say about memory loss, I haven't done a lot of study, particularly on memory loss, but there was one study that I was reading that actually found that because older people are more sensitive to memory loss, they perceive normal loss of memory as something they should worry about. So absolutely, memory loss is real. It is, we all suffer from it. From age 35, it starts to go downhill. But don't try to balance the stress of being worried about it with a healthy dose of realizing that everybody forgets things. Because if you worry about it, you'll end up with more memory loss because of the stress. So be kind to yourselves in pretty much all of this. Very normal. As we age, our bodies change. Joints get muscles that we want to stay loose get tight, and so do joints, whereas things that we want to stay tight get loose. So we have to keep an eye on both of those things. And in order to keep those muscles moving, we have to move them. So one of the greatest things that you can do is keep moving. Have some basic movement plans, healthy movement. Where your hands are concerned, I'm also very envious. You had a 10? I've only ever had an octave.
I'm 5'3", but I have pretty big hands, and
Can I borrow that?
I still can't play Franck though without cheating.
Good.
So yeah.
You're human. Good. Okay. Wonderful. So, yeah, as we age, our hands, of course, we use them so much. So one of the greatest mitigating factors you can is to be kind to your hands. So use bottle openers. Open the door with your shoulder. Don't lift bags with your wrist. Let's see, I have a whole list of kind of mitigation methods that, just work smart. Don't, you want to watch out, like if you're trying to bang on something, don't do it with your wrist. Use an actual machine. This is a very sensitive joint. We don't want to do things with that. Don't whack. That's not good. Don't overstretch things. Don't overuse. I'm looking at my list. Twisting, you want to be a little careful with. We don't need to twist. We can just be smarter and use our hands. Now, a lot of people hear that and they say, but we have to keep moving in order to keep doing it. Yes, but this isn't necessarily a good movement we need to work on. So if you're having a particular issue, go see somebody. Go see a physical therapist. Have a 30-minute session with them. Talk with them about what your range of motion is. They will be able to potentially diagnose you, but at the very least, they'll be able to give you some mitigation strategies, some stretches, and some strengthening. One of the main joints that tends to go as we age is this one right here at the base of the thumb. right? A lot of people end up, and I will share my screen for this because it's absolutely fascinating. I think some of you will recognize this either in yourself or in other colleagues and friends. Let me see. There we go. So this right here, sorry, at the very top of the page, that's extreme. Most of you probably won't have that, particularly because wonderfully you are continuing to use your hands. But we do want to prevent that. So there are a couple things, and I can send this scan to anybody. This is a book that is now technically in the public domain because it's out of print, but it was made for patients so they could learn about their hands, particularly about their thumbs, because we use our thumbs for so much, and it is such a useful book. You can look through and try things. So what ends up happening here is that joint starts to collapse, which means that this muscle right here, which is really important for us as musicians, starts to collapse and get really tight. So you can see right here, this person is starting to try and relax that muscle a little bit. And again, I will send this to you, so don't feel like you need to try and take notes on it or anything, but opening up that joint a little bit. And then what we want to do is support it. So there are some exercises we can do with that. This first one right here, looking at making a C with our hands. Some of you, instead of making a C, will have an L because that joint won't want to, you'll have something more like that. I'm not going to practice doing that. But yeah, so everybody will kind of have a different point. So these exercises are to try and help us to make that nice circle, to make that C. So we want to kind of relax this muscle so that we have that space. And then what we can do is if we're having trouble making the C because this joint wants to collapse, we can actually support it with the opposite hand so that it actually goes out. And I'm happy to send people videos with this kind of thing. And please, if you have particular questions, ask me or go see a certified hand therapist because they are very qualified and they can give you very specific things that help. But the other one that's really interesting to do is to support the muscle on this side. And this is the muscle that raises our pointer fingers. So what we can do is we want to isolate that muscle. So the way that we isolate that muscle is literally, and I would normally have my arm on the table so that I'm not using any other muscles to keep it up, but we're going to do that. And just lift your pointer finger. And the muscle I can feel is right here. And I think even maybe you can see it going. I have a
Hey,
video.
Katelyn, what we're
Yeah.
seeing is your screen, not
Oh,
your
I'm so
hands.
sorry. Thank you. I will pause the. Goodness, I feel like they've updated Zoom since I last did this. All right, can you see me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So another exercise that we can do in order to support this joint right here is to work on this muscle right here. And the way that we isolate that is we want to relax the hand, preferably on a table. I wouldn't have it this high. I would just have it relaxed on the table. I'd be sitting like this, but just imagine that. And then we want to isolate it by just lifting our pointer finger. So these are tiny, tiny exercises. They're not lifting weights. This is to support joints and to maintain mobility. It's not to, look ripped in the end. So we can do that. And then once this is comfortable and we're happy isolating this muscle right here, then we can add a little bit of resistance, just a tiny bit. These are just little tiny, tiny movements. But that joint is so important for us as keyboardists because that is the biggest stretch of our hands. So if we lose this muscle's elasticity right here, we lose the 10th, typically. This is very general. This is, everybody has a different story, but that might be one of the reasons why some of you might be noticing some collapse of that distance. So that would be the chief thing that I've noticed in players and the chief thing that I work with people on is supporting the thumb and then figuring out how to use it to go underneath the hand so we maintain that mobility. And then how to also discuss different kinds of discomfort and pain because a lot of us end up with some kind of arthritis. And we really want to figure out arthritis is typically the as far as I understand it, is the denigration of that fluid that makes the joints move smoothly. So we end up with bone against bone, which is not good because then we start wearing away at these wonderful joints that have enabled us to play for so long. So again, speak with therapists because for different types of arthritis, there's different kinds of treatment. Sometimes it's more genetic and sometimes it's more environmental, and they can really help you to work through that. But I hope that a little introduction connection to the painful thumb might help a little bit in kind of explaining why that collapses as we get older. Has any questions come up through that?
Not yet. I don't see any questions in the chat.
That's not a problem.
A whole bunch of things went through my head as you were saying all of
Please.
that. One of the things, because some of us grew up in the Virgil Fox era, and I actually knew him, and a lot of his students were friends and so forth, and he taught, you probably know this, for technique, he would have finger, what do we call it? Trilling. So, okay, if you can see my hand, he would say, all right, isolate 2 fingers and trill with the other 3, 1 against 2. So you would end up going trill this way, 1 against, and then all combinations of that, and then this. This was for finger independence, and then you would go through the hand and do every possible combination. So when I was riding in trains in France, for instance, that's what I would do. You mentioned that on your blog. In addition to going through stop changes and other musical things, I would, work on finger independence. Do you consider that dangerous at all for the 4th finger?
Don't see it. It's like when people ask you about snapping joints. I would ask a physical therapist. I will always defer to that because they have the final, they have years of training on me, certainly. I would say particularly as we get older, we want to watch out for overuse. So if you're doing this for hours and hours, that's probably not great. Your pointer finger doesn't want to do this for hours and hours. Vary it. I mean, do 1 and 3, do 2 and 4. You're not overusing that joint in that sense. But if you're on a 3-hour train ride and you're only doing 1 trill, that's probably not something that's great because you're never relaxing those muscles. So the thing you want to make sure is that you're practicing the relaxation as much as you're practicing the independence.
Yeah.
And if it hurts, don't do it.
Right. And he would say that, and he would say, it doesn't matter how fast you do it. It's just for the independence to know that your brain can connect to your fingers in that way. So it wasn't an exercise that was difficult at all, but it took brain power to do it. Yeah.
That makes more sense to me too, and actually would be a great warm-up if you know that you're going to practice on a really heavy instrument, to just start moving those muscles slowly and waking up your brain even more than you're waking up your fingers. That makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, I was going to ask you too about Les Anges that you just played, the Angels. There you were trilling and trilling and trilling. And did you, I mean, you have such facility, and it looks so effortless when you play. We noticed that in your Bach playing as well. The judges all noticed your hands. This was a competition in which we could see the contestants. Sometimes we can't see the contestants, and you end up with a different kind of player. But in this case, we could see you, and we could see your dress, which is wonderful. But it made me think of Peggy Haas, who had won years and years and years ago, and then didn't really pursue a concert career after that. She could have, but didn't. But I think yours is going to be completely different from those days when that was unusual to have a female win the competition. I hate to come back to that, but it was such a shock because I was thinking in the judges area, oh, are they all is it going to be 1 against, because, well, there were 2 of us females on the judging panel, and I thought, do we have to get together and talk first so that we can put forward our person that we think plays the most musically, or are they all going to choose the Rager person who played loudly and fast? That wasn't an actual person, but I'm just saying. But however, all 7 of us saw your flexibility and how that communicated to the music. You have a connection to the music, and a grain of something deep that you are trying to express, even though you do it with a great deal of facility and beauty. Not every piece demands that kind of thing and beauty, but the depth is there too. So when you're playing Bach, it's facile, but it also has power and it has strength. And I picture you in France and Germany on some of the very difficult instruments. Saint-Sernin was very difficult when I was there. It's better now. And some of the organs that you practiced on weren't there. Dalbad was there, but in any case, you know, I never thought about it when I was young, but now if I go play a recital or something, I have to think about, do I release the weight after a big chord? And how much does piano background have to do with your how you approach a heavy instrument, for instance?
I'm so glad that you mentioned releasing the weight, because in both piano and organ, we get the key down and nothing else happens. There's nothing else we can do. We can't increase the volume. We can't increase the sound. The best thing we can do is release any kind of tension. And actually, that's the word I'd like to replace release the weight. I like to use the weight to keep the key down, because our arms do have a certain amount of weight. We're not, of course, allowing it to just hang straight down, but we can kind of directionalize it straight into the key. There are instruments where absolutely I have to keep pushing. Masseburg, any of these old Ladegast organs, I am too small to actually keep the keys down without pushing. And those are the instruments that I'm very aware of how I practice. I'm very aware of what I'm doing in the concert, and then I ice my hands afterwards, because it's gonna be a tough go. And I go into it knowing that. I go in practicing on heavier instruments so that I can learn to release as much of the tension as possible and figure out how to focus it. But a lot of what I do is from piano techniques, because one of the reasons why I really got into this, besides my mother being a certified hand therapist, is that I developed tendonitis when I was 13 in both wrists. So I suddenly had to learn how to completely change my playing technique and how to play more efficiently, and how to stop myself from having problems. And it's actually, once you get tendonitis, it comes back. So it's been about 5 or 6 years since I've had my last flare up, which is about the longest time that I've had between flare-ups, and maybe it will be the last one. But so I ended up having to learn how to use my thumbs properly and how to use my pinky and how to strengthen exactly the muscles that I needed to have in order to play without having injuries. So relaxation, body awareness, figuring out where there is excess tension. Yes, shoulders, absolutely. I always would laugh, because when I was at Oberlin, I studied with Jim Christie, and he would tell me that my shoulders were tense by punching me in the shoulders. And I always wanted to turn to him and say, "That's not going to get me to relax, Jim. What are you doing?" So, yeah, he really worked on me with that. And that is something I still work on, because when I'm in a recital situation, of course, tension changes. But it's amazing how the more you practice it and the more that you're aware of it, even in recitals, I can release tension while playing, which I consider to be a victory, because I think it's one of the most important things that we can do. So releasing tension in daily tasks. Notice if while you're trying to get the can opener that you're using to save your hands, to see if your right shoulder's raised. See if while you're lifting those boxes, you're actually using your shoulders. Because with our livelihoods these days, we end up with overdeveloped shoulders, underdeveloped mid-back, underdeveloped core, and way shortened iliopsoas muscles and hip flexors. So we have to kind of balance and know where our overstressed muscles are, so that we can say to them, "Hey, calm down. I need to use my back for this." And then we can start to kind of straighten things out and start, it's that whole ironic thing of the most tense people have no idea that they're tense. So we kind of have to realize that in general, we're way over tense, and we have to start learning how to release that. Now, musicians particularly actually become much more body aware by necessity, because we're listening to our bodies, we're being told what our bodies are doing. So we have an edge on everybody there, but we can still do that throughout daily life. So you were asking about like efficient motion. One of the things that I like to think most about, and actually there was a question in the chat that this actually has to do with, is having them getting the most money for what we're putting in. So think about a snare drummer. He's not controlling every single one of these, right? He's doing one impetus every so often, and then he's allowing gravity, he's allowing inertia, he's working smarter rather than harder. So one of the main things that we can do with those trills, with things like the Vierne, is have as many motions in one. Use big muscles instead of small ones. So a lot of those scales that I'm doing, it's really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for me, that's one arm motion. I'm using a minimum of stressed muscles in those 5 fingers that move. And I'm using the arm instead to place the fingers over the keys so that I'm not doing any kind of weird twisting things. Now, this sounds overwhelming if you haven't done it before, and I'm sure most of you have, but one way that you can just tackle this a little bit at a time is when you're having a weird section that maybe has a scale or some chords or something, just take 5 minutes and start watching your hands and observe what they're doing. See if you're doing a funny twisty thing, and see if you can place your arm by, moving it one direction or the other, by still allowing your shoulders to have weight, and place it over the keys so that maybe you can just be a little bit more efficient in that motion. And all of a sudden, it might release a little bit of tension for you and allow you to play, those 5 chords without having 7 movements. We really want to have bang for the buck. So the comment by Philip about rapidly repeated sequences, for instance, in a toccata, most toccatas, they're touch pieces, right? So we have repeated things. So I want you to figure out how to have the most efficient movement for every single one of those repeated things. Vitor toccata, that should be 1 down up. That's all. And that movement, that wrist rotation, which when I say rotation is more side to side, but remember the wrist is the queen in chess. She can go any direction she needs to. That is a motion that is circular and allows us to release tension without going too far out of a neutral position. We don't want to end up in this position or this position either, because then we constrict blood flow, and that's not so interesting. So figuring out how you can allow your arm and your wrist to put you right over the keys so that everything is within your reach without you having to stretch your fingers for it, because that is something that is not natural. So, but feel free to send me a specific section and I will very happily have a look at it for you, because every toccata is a little bit different. So might have some specific pointers for that particular piece. Did that answer your question, Susan?
Yeah, that was Phil's question, and a good one. The Vitor is one of those pieces that when you were in France, I'll bet. Well, I've heard your recording of it, and I remember, Dupre playing it, for instance, at Saint-Sulpice, and Vitor himself takes a completely different approach to the piece than we do with our electro-pneumatic play it as fast as you can kind of thing. So I know that's you can have the facility to do it, but the gravity of the piece loses sometimes, and those first 3 notes that are connected are lost when they're just notes. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, but the influence of style on how you play, because it depends on what organs the piece is derived from. And I know you're married to an organ builder, and you're very aware of organs and their history and how they feel, and they really are different from Germany to France and Spain and so forth. George has a question too coming up, but address that, and then George will call on you, another Fulbright person playing in his 80s.
I'll have to do a roll call later. Vitor toccata, of course, what's very nice about those Barker actions is that they still are lighter than if we had direct tracker with all 3 manual couplers on. So we do have that manual assists there, but it certainly does inform how you play, particularly attack and release. When I found with the Barkers, it's fast attack, slow release, and the Barker does that for you. So all of a sudden, those staccatos become a lot easier because you just kind of release them and keep your hand moving. And all of a sudden, the only thing is that single impetus that we talked about with the snare drum player, right on your pinky, which is the weakest finger. So we want to have this be nice and strong, this muscle here and this muscle here, so we can extend the pinky. It's similar to that exercise I was talking about with the pointer finger, but it's with the pinky. So we strengthen that muscle and also the ones of the palm. So we have the one impetus there, and everything kind of else falls from that. What's of course very interesting about the Vito Toccata is first of all tempo, because we have one of his original scores in which he kept crossing out his tempo marking and making it slower. And then we have, I think 4 different editions of it, all with different staccatos and different slurs, and we won't even get into that debate because everybody has their favorite one. So pick your favorite and go with that. And I hope that it makes you feel relaxed as you play it, because actually that piece is so full of problems. The left hand is its own issue as well. You have full chords that you need to remember to bounce. And also remember, your hand doesn't need to hover over them in the chord. Play the chord and relax it. Your hand has a split second to get back out to that position, but you have to release. This is the worst position your hands can be in. As they age, as they're youthful, I don't care. This is complete tension for very small muscles that need that blood flow that we're stopping from happening when we have them completely tense. So just relax your hand. Every 5 minutes in your practice, relax, and then go back to practicing. But just keep in touch with your body, because we play the instrument and we play our bodies equally as much. So if you haven't done much with body awareness, I will once again say, please do, because it is so important.
George, you had a question? George, did you want to ask Katelyn a question?
Well, no, not at the moment. A question I had earlier was how you have a smaller hand than I have, probably. And my teacher, Dr. Helen Hewitt, had a very small hand, and she did amazing things with the swell to great 16-foot and the swell to choir 4-foot and thumbing down from different manuals. Did you ever do all of that, or did you figure out some other way to get around the problem?
Well, I do play Franck, and I will admit that at the beginning of the third chorale and the prière, I absolutely couple down to the pedal because I physically can't reach it. I do end up rewriting things because I do have an octave and a ninth with some particular intervals. So there are pieces that I could not play otherwise. The Duraflé Toccata, of course, you have those da-dum, bum, bum, ba-da-da, bum, and that is a 10th, so I just rewrite it. But I'm also what we call hypermobile. So I'm super flexible. So more than anything, at the moment, I have to be cognizant of strengthening my muscles so that I don't overstretch them. So I do have a little bit of help for that. I can get into some weird positions for Rager. But it is absolutely a balance. I would say that no matter what your physiology is, you're probably going to end up doing some things to some repertoire just to make it work for you, because you don't have the body of the composer or the person for whom that piece was intended, and that is extremely normal. And if you haven't done that, I'd really like to see what your body looks like, because I think there really is no one piece that fits all, and certainly no instrument.
Yeah, there are some questions in the chat, and a very nice comment from Dodd Lamberton, who joins us from Pennsylvania, the Lehigh chapter, and I think you can all read that if you look at the chat, discussing the rehab for his thumb and surviving fine with occasional cortisone shot in that joint. I think you addressed that pretty well. And then
Amazing.
Unless you have something more to add to that.
No,
And then
that's incredible. Amazing
I know.
work.
Then what verbal direction and visual feedback do you find effective in teaching someone to release the tension, particularly when they transition from piano to organ? And that's Johanna is there. Hi.
Thank you. That's fabulous. I think the first step is really teaching that kind of body awareness. And there are various methods to do that. You probably have one that you use with your students. Sometimes I'll suggest that, and you know, it depends on the student too. I'll suggest that they lie on the floor and then they tell me where their right pinky is. And they tell me what their pinky is touching. And to just move it and start getting that kind of kinesthetic sense of where their body is in space, which they already have, but trying to bring it to the conscious level. You know, you try it with the pinky, you try flexing your toes and then releasing them. So you kind of need an overall body awareness in order to start becoming aware of the tension so you can release the tension. And one of the greatest ways to become aware of tension is to consciously cause it. So raise your shoulders. That's why we do that with kids, right? Raise them so you can release them. So, you know, if you see a student being really tense with a particular movement, see if you can get them to consciously do it so they become aware of what that movement feels like. And then you can start guiding them through releasing that tension and finding another direction to put whatever energy that is, because tension is often stress or some kind of energy. They're trying to put musicality into it and haven't realized that that is not the way to do it. You know, finding another outlet for that level of enthusiasm is really important, and sometimes it just takes time. But becoming
Right.
aware of it is really that first step. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Right. Yes, thank you. I don't know if you're hearing me, but I've had the privilege recently of just helping a couple of pianists transition to organ, and that's one of the first things I notice is just their, overplaying basically. And I'm also kind of wondering what to watch for, because I can talk about it, or I can ask them to release or point out that the key doesn't need any more force to go down, but I guess I'm wondering also what to look for in my students to know that they are playing with more ease and effortlessness and, economy of motion, that kind of thing.
I would suspect your instincts are probably very good on this, but if something looks unnatural, it probably is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's logic is logic. I'd be really curious with your students who are transitioning to the organ. Do they play with the same with tension when they play the piano? Because it could just be translating.
So this is the interesting thing. I'm not their piano teacher, but I am their organ teacher. So one of them, an adult, he verbally told me, he's like, "Oh yeah, I overplay on everything." And I'm like, "Okay." And he's like in his 20s
Here we
already.
go.
So,
Yeah.
alrighty. So maybe another good question is, as you were saying, that effort, how can it be redirected or more effectively directed than pushing the keys?
Sounds like he's slightly proud of it, which is difficult. So he's
Yes.
aware of it, which is great. But if he's proud of it, it's kind of saying, all right, do you want to get rid of it?
Like, this
we
is what I
totally can.
do.
If that's what you do and how you define yourself, there's very little I'm going to be able to do as a teacher except to say it's not great for you, and I'd really like to see you playing for a long time, but it's your choice. I mean, you're an adult. I'd be really curious to see him at the piano and see if you could absolutely do this. You should do this. Have him just play for you on the piano. See if there's any differences. Part of some of that, what I've noticed is that their feet aren't flat on the floor on the organ. So if you can find a way, like if they're just playing a manuals alone piece, take all the stops off the pedal board, just have them rest their toes there, have them rest their feet on the heel rack behind them, have them rest a foot on the swell shoe in front of you. That's one of the best things we can do as organists is find a way to support our feet, because every Alexander technician, every ergonomist looks at us and they're like, "Oh, your feet aren't supported. What do we do with you?" But it's really not that bad. Just make sure you keep moving and that you rest your feet as much as you can, because we just don't want to put that strain on the lower back of just having all that weight of your legs hanging down. So if he's compensating for that discomfort, or if one of your students is potentially working with them on just what to do with your feet, so they're not like tense in the whole lower
holding
quadrant.
everything. Yeah.
Exactly. That's never comfortable. Yeah, so if you can kind of relax from the ground up, that helps a lot too. But watch for anything that looks unnatural, and then see if you can just kind of guide them through, learn with them. It's their body. Anybody who works with them will be learning with them as much as they're teaching them. So just explore that.
Thank you.
Caitlin, it's an issue with harpsichordists, actually, or organists going to harpsichord, which is usually what happens because they have an extra credit that they need, and they think, oh, harpsichord's easy, I can, and boy, that is tricky, because talk about release of weight and not even making the descent to the bottom of the key. You absolutely pluck it at the top without even going down to the bottom, and that is very difficult for organists to do. But if they can do it, then it helps their organ playing too. Laura had a question about the length of time that you would recommend practicing sitting at the keyboard at the console before getting off to let's see, to relax. Yeah, great.
Breaks are so important no matter what you're doing. I mean, we don't want to stand for 6 hours at a time. We don't want to sit for 6 hours at a time. The general suggestion, I think, is, 20 to 25 minutes, but you don't have to set a timer necessarily. Just keep your eye on the clock, and then around 20 minutes, 25 minutes, when you catch yourself at a stopping pause point, keep thinking about what you're practicing. Do one lap and then go sit back down, or get up, grab a drink of water, sit back down, go to the bathroom. And then get yourself out of that. I think she'd like to unmute so she can be a part of the conversation. Can we? Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Please feel free to type in any follow-up questions or anything that isn't clear. Or just wave. Yeah, so
she can't unmute because there's a feedback issue there.
I'm so sorry, Laura. And if I don't answer anything, please just follow up later. So yeah, breaks are extremely important. Drink enough water, so you have to go to the bathroom every hour, because drinking water is also really important to make sure that your muscles and joints are still moving. So breaks, also at the computer, which is even more difficult, I find. When you take breaks, think about it, we're sitting in very similar positions at the keyboard. So, allow yourself to kind of move out of this and just, depending on your level of flexibility, when you're stretching, you just want to stretch to your comfort level. Remember, I'm hyper flexible sometimes. So you just get out, get your shoulders out, get your legs, maybe do some kind of hip exercises just to get that moving in the opposite direction. Just, do a little dance around, but something that gets you out of this and that gets you out of this, because I did hear Susan say something about eyesight issues. And even though I don't have aging eyes yet, I am legally blind without visual aids, so I can have a little sympathy yet. So make sure that you have the proper, and most of you probably do, the proper eyesight, eyewear, so that you can see the music, so that you're not ending up like this after hours. Or if your music desk is a bit high, be aware that you might be like this, which is not great for these muscles in the back of your neck. So if you know that your music desk is a little bit too high, or that you tend to do this, one great exercise very carefully to do is called neck retraction, which is just this. And you can use your pointer finger to just help you to be aware. So you just bring in the neck backwards, just to kind of counterbalance that. And if you're like this, bring your neck down, have a look at your feet, and just kind of move it around and get yourself out of whatever static posture you've been in. So those are some of the best things you can do during breaks. It's not just taking a break, it's also kind of waking up any muscles that were held or that were stretched for a long period of time.
I have two questions. One is, how do you prepare differently for a competition? And how do you deal if you experience stress, or are you so concentrated on relaxing and everything you're doing with flexibility that doesn't even enter your mind to think about it?
Oh, relax because I'm stressed. No. Competitions are so unique. You have to go into them usually for not the reason of winning a competition. You go into them for making the connections. You go into them for being exposed to the instrument. I went into competitions to go to fun places. I had just had a ball doing competitions, and I'm also very happy to be retired from them. I never intend to do one again. So So what I did with a lot of competitions, because you have very limited practice time and you're typically meeting in instruments for the first time and you have to just get a ton done in a short period of time, I made as many notes beforehand as I could. I pretty much did all of my registrations on paper, and then of course listened once I got to the instrument. The first thing I did when I sat down was listen to every single voice in the orchestra that I had available to see if it actually matched up with the idea I had in my mind. But just doing the registrations beforehand helped me to figure out kind of what the layout was, what was available, and then I changed everything, of course. But it really gave me kind of like, it was like doing a practice test before actually sitting down to do the test. And at least, the test would have the same number of questions, even if they were completely different. And then what I would do is a ton of mental practice afterwards. I might only have, I remember in Russia, I had an hour and a quarter to set in a 60-minute program for the finals. That was horrible. I never recommend anybody do that. But what I was able to do was I finished the practice time fairly, went back to the hotel, and just kind of relived that instrument in my mind so that I knew where everything was. So it's a lot of actually work off the bench more than it is in the actual practice space. And I did not think about relaxation or ergonomics while I was playing, but particularly with NYACOP and with most of these final rounds, it's typically a program that you've chosen. It's music you love. And then I just sat, I remember very vividly right before NYACOP going up there and saying, well, what the heck, I like this music. And I just played, which probably helped a little bit. We're very lucky to do this for a living. It's pretty
Yeah,
extraordinary.
I think that's exactly what the listeners heard, was that you loved the music and you wanted to communicate it, and that really came through. And in addition to the fact that it was perfect in every regard, there was that. But
There were wrong notes, I promise.
I don't
You're
think
very
so.
kind. Thank you.
Nobody was aware of them. Let's put it that way. The musicianship won. My other question is, if you use improvisation as a teaching tool, and did you learn improvisation from when you were in France? At Toulouse, did he teach that at Toulouse? By the way, you probably know I lived in that area for quite some time and had a house down there, and knew Xavier Darras so well, and it's such a tragedy when he lost his arm. And but his mother is she still playing at almost 100?
I actually wasn't able to meet her while I was there. I never crossed paths with her. But of course, every time that I would climb up in the cathedral where she was organist, you laugh because they have a motion sense light. Not a motion sense light. It's a light that you click on, and you have to climb all the way up to the roof at this cathedral. It's spectacular. And then you walk across the roof to get into the organ loft. But it's very sweet, the story that they had to install a second clicker halfway up because as she aged, she just couldn't get up in the one amount of time because it was a time off clicker. So I started on piano with sight reading. I still don't remember actually learning to read music, but it was very much about the visual for me, which is ironic considering my visual problems. Memorization and improvisation have not been very strong in my background because I find it absolutely terrifying. I am so linked to being able to see what's going on. It's one of the reasons why I pursued organ instead of piano, because it actually allowed me to be able to pursue a career. Whereas with piano, I would have been required to a much more stringent degree to memorize. And of course, for my degree programs, I absolutely played recitals from memory. And I did study improvisation. I'm a fine liturgical improviser, but I certainly would never try to do it to the level of French improvisateur. But Philippe Lefebvre would come down probably about once a month while I was in Toulouse to teach. The problem is that we never found out when that would be until 24 hours before, and I was never in town. He came down 9 times. So it was very difficult to plan. And that was the only improvisation possibility for while I was in France. I did study with Jean-Baptiste Dupont, who is the organist over in Bordeaux at the cathedral there. So I did work with him on improvisation. And it was very sweet. In our first lesson, he had me improvise and he goes, yes, you will never be a recitalist for improvising. I said, I knew that. I don't need help with that.
I actually didn't know that. I entered a competition for improvisers in Lyon, and of all the contestants, I came in last. So that's when I learned that I was so proud of what I had learned. But Guy Beauvais and Yves Duvernay won that competition, and Yves became the organist at Notre Dame and had a heart attack and died, unfortunately, shortly after, but Guy is still going. but
They grow
that's how
up
I learned
speaking
my
that
lesson.
language. They grow up speaking that language, and some people just have, there is a certain amount of talent, and also um, some of the greatest success just comes from being able to let go. And some people have a lot more ease with that. um, and it's wonderful to watch. It's just it's magical in a way, because it looks like the music simply flows from them. So instead I just subject myself to being an interpreter for life, and I'm perfectly content with this situation. But I do teach improvisation. I'm very good at basic improvisation because I've had to work so hard for it. So I'm very good at explaining that to people who particularly have kind of a mental block around it, and we can kind of just have fun together, because I will embarrass myself equally. So I'll just have a few extra ideas, to help them out with. And I love doing that sort of thing. And especially I have a couple of organ builders that I'm teaching in town. And it's so good for them to just be able to sit down and kind of follow their ear to test stops and to see what's going on with that. I find that so much fun, because they do hear so differently to us. They're listening more to the instrument than to playing. And then if we talk about how to show off each stop best, I find that to be particularly rewarding.
Well, we are so grateful that you have shared this time with us, and that you love the organ as much as you do, to share it with everyone around the world. You're a great ambassador for the organ, and those of us who are aging and mainly playing for church, which keeps me. I love him playing, and that keeps me going, and probably will. And I'm going to be Vierne on the bench playing him probably. But thank you
Not for
ever
many
so much.
decades yet.
Oh, well, you never know. We never know at this point. That doubt is there. So I don't see any more questions, but we thank you so very much for being with us, Katelyn. And
I've just put my email into the chat, so do make a note of that. It's very easy. It's katelyn.emerson@gmail.com. So if you have any comments or thoughts or further questions, or like practice techniques, or physical things that you want to just discuss, please feel free to do so. It's one of the most, community is one of the greatest things that we have as musicians, and I'm so honored to have such wonderful colleagues. So
we will attempt to keep going.
absolutely. Do more than attempt.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.